Now we see this war coming back again, and we begin to see how central it has been to geopolitics really for the last 15 years or so.
One of the key winners in all this is Israel. Israel has been looking forward to the day when Iran's regional influence is weakened. And now is a moment. Ultimately, the situation is complicated, but it's actually also simple at the same time. Everybody wants power. Everybody wants influence. And these rebel groups in particular are all being pragmatic.
Of course, what's coming down the line as well in January is Donald Trump in the White House. Where might he sit on this one? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. Syria has burst into the news again because rebel forces have taken the world and the Syrian government by surprise by not just taking the second city of Syria, Aleppo, back into their control, but expanding both to the north and to the south. Now, Syria has long been at the center of everything in the Middle East, but it had essentially gone quiet for a few years. The front lines in this long civil war had been frozen for around 4 years. So we as news organizations had rather looked the other way. But not everyone was so short-sighted. People like Lina, Khatib, who joins us today from Chatham House and has been watching Syria very, very closely. And of course, our international editor, Lindsey Hilsum, joins us from Ukraine. And of course, the war in Ukraine and Russia's distraction there is also very important in this whole story. So, Lindsey, let's just begin with why Syria is so important.
Well, let's just start because of the Syrians, and because the Syrians who've been through so much suffering and so much war, hundreds of thousands killed, millions turned into refugees. And now we see this war coming back again, and we begin to see how central it has been to geopolitics really for the last 15 years or so. Because remember, it was President Obama who decided not to intervene in Syria, even when Bashar al-Assad crossed the red line and used chemical weapons. And that was an opening for President Putin. So in 2015, the Russians went in with their air power and with some troops on the ground, basically to save President Bashar al-Assad from being overthrown by rebels. It wasn't just about their old friend, Bashar al-Assad. It was about President Putin saying Russia is important on the world stage. Russia is a power to be reckoned with. And it was about Russia filling the void left by the United States of America. So I think a lot has flowed from that decision made by President Putin about Syria back in 2015.
Yes, I mean, Lina, we often talk about the new age of impunity that we are in, and you could argue it began with Syria.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just that. It's the age in which red lines have ceased to have much meaning. When President Obama back in 2013 said that the use of chemical weapons was a red line, privately, Bashar al-Assad took that seriously. But then when Bashar al-Assad saw that this was not followed up with action, he basically just felt that the US rhetoric is not really going to translate into any concrete action, and that red lines were basically rhetorical. And unfortunately, since then, when you look at different incidents in the Middle East where the US has invoked red lines, you'll see a pattern in which threats are not translated into action. And this has hurt the credibility of the United States, not just when it comes to its allies in the region, but also when it comes to its opponents.
Lindsey, can you just explain, Syria's current geopolitical importance? Who its alliances are with and why?
Yeah, so you've got Bashar al-Assad, who is supported by Iran and also very reliant on Hezbollah, also supported by Iran and by Russia. So that's that. And then Shia forces from other parts of the world. I mean, Shia Muslim forces who've come in from other parts of the world. But then the rebels, many of them are backed by Turkey. And there are a lot of different groups, and Lina is going to be much more expert than me on the different groups that there are. But Turkey is a very important player here. But whereas in the past, the Saudis, the UAE, other Gulf countries really supported those rebels, now some of those countries have come round to, well, if not supporting, at least tolerating Bashar al-Assad in the interests of stability. So I think that one of the important questions is, what role is Turkey playing in this reemergence of this war? Because these rebel groups, the Americans, the Western countries, Europe, they're not really a friend to either side. They're certainly not a friend to Bashar al-Assad and his Iranian and Russian backers. But some of these groups were allied with Islamic State, with al-Qaeda. So they're not friends of the West either. And so I think that the critical power in the region is Turkey. President Erdogan is a man who the West can do business with. He's a man who President Putin can do business with, even though they're on opposing sides in this war. He, I would see, as very much a key player. I don't know what you think, Lina.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, we have to emphasize that these groups that are now leading this military campaign against Iran-backed groups in Syria and against the Syrian regime forces no longer are affiliates of ISIS and al-Qaeda. The group leading this alliance of convenience is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. It did begin life in 2012 as an affiliate of al-Qaeda, and it called itself at the time the Nusra Front. And then, of course, you had ISIS rising, and this proved to be a challenge for al-Qaeda. So the two groups in Syria were competing for legitimacy, who was basically more Islamist than the other. But then with time, the Nusra Front started having political ambitions, and it rebranded, changed its name into HTS, and severed ties with al-Qaeda. And not only that, it started fighting al-Qaeda and fighting ISIS as well. And it has emerged as the most militarily powerful group amongst the rebels in the northwest of Syria. And because it has political ambitions, it has set up a de facto government ruling Idlib in northwest Syria. It calls itself the Salvation Government.
But just to be clear on that, I mean, Lina, they're not Democrats, are they? I mean, they are essentially Islamists.
They are still Islamists, and the people who have been under their rule in northwest Syria have persistently protested against them. And so here we have, as I said, an alliance of convenience, because this group and others see a moment in which Assad's Iran backers are weakened. They see Russia distracted in Ukraine. So they feel this is their moment. And they've been training for 4 years to basically improve their military capacity, manufacture their own drones. They set up a military academy to train officers. So you have HTS basically still an Islamist group, but a group that ultimately has political ambition to be part of the political transition in Syria.
So who supports them? I mean, where do they get their weapons? You know, what's the route? Who's giving them the money?
Well, as Lindsey said, they have links with Turkey. Now, Turkey has been quite vague in its stance regarding this current campaign by these rebel groups, because it's not just HTS, it's HTS and some other groups, including a group confusingly called the Syrian National Army, which has nothing to do with the Syrian Arab Forces, which is the regime of Bashar al-Assad's actual army. This is a group set up by Turkey, because Turkey has its own ambitions to be influential in Syria. So Turkey has basically not said that it's against this attack, but at the same time not said that it supports it. But de facto, Turkey benefits from this situation, and without Turkey, these groups would not have the kind of funding and weapons that they enjoy.
So, Lindsey, where does that leave the West? I mean, you know, the truth is, you know, when the sort of the war lines were frozen, the West looked the other way, and they basically let Assad claim victory, despite everything that happened in Aleppo.
We have to talk about one other group, and that is the Kurds, because we've talked about the part of Syria which is controlled by Bashar al-Assad, helped by his allies. And we've talked about the part of Syria, Idlib, in northwest, which is controlled by HTS and these other rebel groups who are basically Sunni. And then you have the northeast. And that is a place which is known as Rojava. And it is controlled by Kurdish forces who are connected to the Kurdish forces over the border in Turkey. And therefore, President Erdogan does not like them at all. However, the West does quite like them. And they are regarded as a more moderate force. I've spent quite a lot of time there. They're very easy to deal with. They're much more, I mean, they have female soldiers, many of whom are very brave and so on. I wouldn't call them democratic, but they are a much more sort of moderate force. But they have some Western backing. You know, there are American troops in there. I was there and I can't even remember what year it was now, but Donald Trump, when he was last in power, suddenly found out that there were American troops somewhere in Syria. And he said, well, we're going to get those out. We don't want them. We don't want that. And that was seen as an utter betrayal of the Kurds, of our allies.
But they're still there, aren't they?
But yeah, he wasn't, in the end, they managed, the people who he was working with at that time, you know, who were,
the guardrails kicked in.
Yes, the adults in the room didn't let him do that. But the Kurdish forces there are quite important to the West. And the reason for that is because they were in the forefront of beating ISIS, Islamic State. You remember it had the caliphate, which had its headquarters in Raqqa. And now there are all these prison camps, which the Kurds run, where they control and hold many of these jihadis. Now, this is very controversial and I would argue extremely cruel, especially to the children who've been held in there. But in there are also, Westerners who went to fight for Islamic State. You know, Shamima Begum is the most famous one from the UK, but there are many others. And countries like the UK and Canada don't want those people back. And it's the Kurds who are imprisoning them, sometimes under not very good conditions, I must say. But that is where the West is, and they don't want that destabilized. So there's another complication to add to this situation. I mean,
because, obviously it's getting very, very complicated to follow, but we have a situation in which Turkey supports one lot, America supports the Kurds, and America and Turkey, who are allies and in NATO together, are supporting opposing factions.
Yes, and President Erdogan and Vladimir Putin, who are on opposite sides on the war, actually get along quite well, which is why I think that Erdogan is the key to any kind of resolution, because he is, and one of the reasons that this has happened is that Erdogan has been pushing Bashar al-Assad for some months now to try and sort some of this out, to come to some kind of accommodation. And Bashar al-Assad has refused to do that. He's a stubborn man. He, again, is a cruel man. He runs what is basically a narco state now. But I think that President Putin may now gang up with Erdogan to say to Bashar al-Assad, you just can't carry on like this. I don't know, Lina, have I got that all wrong?
No, I was going to say that this is part of the reason why Turkey is being vague about this campaign by the rebels, because it's a way to pressure Assad to finally agree to a deal. I mean, ultimately, the situation is complicated, but it's actually also simple at the same time. Everybody wants power. Everybody wants influence. And these rebel groups in particular, including the Kurds actually, are all being pragmatic. So you will see, if you, like me, follow the communiques by these rebel groups conducting the campaign against Assad and the Iran proxies, most of the time, they are not talking about Russia. In fact, they issued an open statement to Russia saying, our fight is not with you. What this tells me is that they want a deal at some point made between them, Russia, and Turkey about power sharing in Syria.
Right. So what does a deal begin to look like? Are you talking about carving up Syria effectively?
No.
Or having some sort of federation or what?
No, what they are interested in is be part of the political transition. Now, there is a UN-led peace process, which, of course, sadly has led nowhere in terms of political transition. There was a UN Security Council resolution Resolution 2254, that says there has to be political transition in Syria, which basically means Assad stepping aside. And a group of people who have been brought by the UN from both sides were meant to come up with some sort of power sharing deal that involves elements from the old Assad regime and elements from the opposition in its different factions. However, because HTS and all those Islamist groups in the Northwest are listed as terrorists by many countries around the world, they are not part of this political process. What they're hoping would happen, and here, Lindsey, maybe you can weigh in, is basically have a scenario a bit like the Taliban in Afghanistan, whereby they are eventually recognized as legitimate political actors and be part of this political transition at large.
Well, I don't think that the Taliban are accepted as legitimate political actors. It's just that nobody knows what to do about it. And because the Americans pulled their forces out in such a precipitous way, that's what we ended up with. And now everybody just sort of, keeps coughing twice and looking the other way and taking absolutely no notice about the horrendous things that are happening to women there. But Lina, it's very hard for me to see how this kind of transition could work without a carve-up of the country. Because Bashar al-Assad, as I understand it, is not going to step aside unless there's a coup against him. And I can't see how these enemies could work together because they have such different visions for the country. And because the country is ruined and is now entirely dependent, as I can see it, on drugs, as a way of fueling the economy, this drug Captagan, which Hezbollah and the Assad regime traffic in order to keep things going. I just find it very hard to see how you turn that into any kind of functioning state.
Functioning is the key word here. I would give you Lebanon as an example of a country in which you had many, many, many factions fighting with one another and then realizing that no one can actually win. And in the end, agreeing to a very flawed power sharing agreement. So unfortunately, I am not predicting that even if Assad is removed, whether by force, which is what these rebel groups are now trying to do, or whether, eventually Erdogan and Putin manage to kind of carve up some political deal with him. I don't see the future being rosy, unfortunately, for, at least the short term in Syria, because we've seen what these, kind of so-called peace-building agreements based on power sharing can do.
And it's also far from clear whether any of these groups and the government have any kind of popular support that would last. I mean, when you're on the ground there and you talk to people, they say whatever they feel they have to say at the time. I remember being in West Aleppo and talking to people about the Syrian, the Assad government, and them saying, yes, it's more stable, and that, we'd rather be here. But there was nothing convincing about it. And none of those options are offering any kind of real political freedom. They don't offer democracy. They don't offer sort of power to the people in any sense. So, I mean, whatever you end up with in terms of a deal, it wouldn't be very stable, would it?
It wouldn't be. And sadly, you are most likely going to end up with a scenario in which Syria is run by a Russian puppet who would be a replacement for Assad. The democratic forces within Syria, civil society, the intellectuals, the people who believe in liberal democracy, will then have another fight on their hands, which will be a political fight, not a military one, to try to carve out at least some space in this kind of setting.
Lindsey,
for most ordinary Syrians, what they would want, I mean, democracy, freedom, I love it all. But for most Syrians, if you could get up in the morning and go to work and make a living and know that your house wasn't going to be blown up and that your kids would get to school and things would be all right and that you could survive and, bring up a family and so on, you know what? It might be good enough, at least for the moment.
I mean, in the meantime, though, we are seeing Russia bombing Idlib again with Syria, which I think a lot of people might find surprising. Are Russian forces still in Syria in the same way that they were before? And similarly with Hezbollah. I mean, you assume that when Hezbollah was fighting Israel, they would have pulled all their people back. but it seems that Hezbollah is still there as well.
Well, I think some Hezbollah is there, but let me, maybe Lina can tell us more about Hezbollah, and let me tell you a little bit about the Russians. So the Russians are not there in the numbers that they used to be. And although Russia did have a force on the ground, about 5,000 at the maximum, most of those were pulled out in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine because they needed the forces here. And what you were left with was a sort of rump air force. Some, they pulled out some of their fighter bombers and they left some. So the ones that are still there are, yes, in action, bombing people, probably not rebels, probably ordinary people. But President Putin cannot afford to send large numbers of people back in. And the other people who were there fighting for President Bashar al-Assad were, you remember, the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, his people. He had a lot of mercenaries in there. Now, when things wound down in Syria, and after Prigozhin, was in a plane that unfortunately fell out of the sky in some mysterious manner, after he had risen up against President Putin, a lot of those mercenaries were redeployed to this new Africa Corps. So they were sent to parts of Africa. So, and now, here in Ukraine, what I've seen on the front line is that the Russians are advancing, and it's important to them to get into a position of strength before President Trump comes into office in January, because they know that he's going to try and force some kind of negotiation. So the last thing President Putin wants to do at the moment is weaken his forces here in Ukraine in order to deal with this problem over there in Syria. He wants to keep his forces here, which is why I think he's going to call on President Erdogan.
Yeah, and also when it comes to Russia and Syria, because it remains the more dominant actor amongst the two foreign backers of Assad, Iran and Russia, Russia doesn't need to deploy huge resources because it knows it's still going to be influential. It knows it can make a deal with whoever is left on the ground. And already, as I said, the rebel groups have already appealed to the Russians to kind of say, our fight is not with you. So they are ready for a deal. So Russia doesn't need these resources. Now, in terms of why it's bombing civilian areas in Idlib right now and not, for example, bombing the rebels directly, meaning military targets, it's because it thinks that this way it can push the rebels to go back to the northwest to defend civilian areas. But what the rebels are doing instead is they're keeping advancing south. And as they do that, they are actually acquiring more and more of the arsenal of the Syrian army of Bashar al-Assad and increasing their own air defense capabilities and using those against the Russian planes. So it's actually interesting militarily how the two sides are calculating very differently.
Right. Now, just to sort of make things even more complicated, the big player we haven't talked about is Iran. So Lina, where does Iran sit now? Because there were Revolutionary Guard in Syria, and they're not now, are they?
They are still there. Iran
they are still there.
Yeah, Iran is still present in Syria through various proxy groups like Hezbollah and like groups that are Pakistani and Afghan. And also Hezbollah, of course, Lebanese Hezbollah is supported by Iran. They are still present. However, they are significantly weakened. Even though Hezbollah did not withdraw from Syria to focus on Lebanon, its ability to move in Syria has been curtailed because Israel keeps bombing Iran sites inside Syria. And Hezbollah also is now under a ceasefire agreement with Israel that says that it is not allowed to move its troops in Lebanon or transfer weapons. So Hezbollah can't send reinforcements into Syria from Lebanon. And this has left Iran basically weakened more than ever inside Syria, which is why the rebel groups are taking advantage. But when it comes to Iran, Syria is very important because without Syria, Hezbollah won't be able to have weapons transferred to it from Iran through Syria into Lebanon. And the Captagon trade that Lindsey mentioned is very important. This drug trade is bringing a lot of money to the Assad regime and Hezbollah as well. And this is not something that Iran will want to lose. So Iran will definitely try to prop up the Assad regime, but its ability right now is not what it used to be.
Of course, what's coming down the line as well in January is Donald Trump in the White House. And I mean, we see what he's doing in Gaza, where he has just warned Hamas to release the hostages or face an even bigger onslaught. He seems to be, threatening American attack as well as Israeli. So where might he sit on this one, Lindsey?
I think he's will be in a complicated position because he's also belligerent towards Iran, and obviously, he talks about that. But at the same time, he's also talked about maybe doing some kind of deal with Iran, and then again it comes back to Putin and Ukraine. He says that he's the man who can end wars. He can end the war here in Ukraine in 24 hours. And that means he wants to talk to Putin and he wants to get this thing sorted. But now you have this whole other theater of war, which no single person can really have much impact on, because the Americans largely absented themselves from all of this. It's hard to see how he comes in and sorts it out. So I think once again, it may make him look weak. And that's not a thing that President Trump likes. I mean,
Lina, of course, Trump would argue that he's the only person who was strong on Syria because he did at least bomb Assad over the use of chemical weapons.
Yeah, and now he's also thinking and saying that this time he's not going to be as nice vis-a-vis Iran. I think Trump obviously recognizes that in his first term, he may claim that no wars were happening in the Middle East, which of course is not true. But he did not manage to make a deal happen for Syria, or to get Iran to basically behave according to international law, because it kept enriching nuclear elements. And it kept destabilizing the region. This is not something that his presidency dealt with in the first term. So I think now he's looking at all those issues as one interconnected issue, which is about Iran's influence in the region. And he is indicating, and this can be seen through the people he has hired in his cabinet, that he will pursue another iteration of the so-called maximum pressure policy towards Iran. But this time it's a higher maximum. Now, at the same time, he does not want the US to be involved in military action in the Middle East. He does not want a quagmire like the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so I think he's going to mostly use economic sanctions on Iran, more so than before. He's probably going to seek to completely cancel the nuclear deal with Iran and instead negotiate with Iran on a deal that would link the nuclear enrichment file with Iran's regional destabilization, taking advantage of the weakening of Iran in the region right now. I mean, despite the rhetoric, Iran's so-called narrative of unity of fronts, that all its proxies will spring into action in a huge way together, has not quite happened. And so there is fear in Iran and worry regarding what the Trump administration might do. So, maybe this will be the silver lining in all of this.
I mean, Lindsey, it's worth just pausing for a moment to think if all that were to come to pass, Donald Trump would be the man who ends the war in Ukraine, ends the war in the Middle East, and puts Iran back in its box. I mean, he could come out of this incredibly well.
It depends how long term you're talking, isn't it? Because, ending wars is one thing and freezing conflicts is another. And that's what we've seen in Syria, that the conflict was frozen. It wasn't over. And I think that here in Ukraine, you could see the conflict frozen, but not over. And then what everybody here fears is President Putin coming back for more. And so doing a deal anywhere in the world where you force it and you say everything stops, you can tout that as peace. But that isn't peace. That's just a temporary absence of war. And that does not solve the deep underlying problems that any of these countries have.
We must remember that one of the key winners in all this is Israel. Israel has been looking forward to the day when Iran's regional influence is weakened. And now is a moment. Although Israel had considered Assad to be a convenient leader of Syria because he did not himself form a threat to Israel, the proliferation of Iran-backed groups, including Hezbollah, threatening Israel in the Middle East is not in its interests. And now there is a moment for it to change this status quo.
And of course, one of Israel's biggest backers is President-elect Trump. So he may be pushing for ever more Israeli influence in the region, whatever Arabs and others think about it.
We must leave it there. Lindsey, Lina, thank you both very much indeed. That's the forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.